Hey parents, Greenlight is here to take one big thing off your to-do list, teaching your kids about money. With a Greenlight debit card and money app of their own, kids and teens learn to earn, save, and invest. You can send money instantly, set flexible controls, and get real-time notifications of your kids' money activity. Set up chores and put allowance on autopilot to reward them for their hard work. Then learn about the world of money together. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.
We think of the Secret Service as this elite unit, the most sophisticated protection service in the world. You would never imagine that someone could come as close as they came to shooting one of the agency's protectees.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battle Lines.
I made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
On today's episode, we check in with Deputy US Editor Rozina Sabur about what the assassination attempt against Donald Trump tells us about political extremism in the United States. And senior foreign correspondent Sophia Yan reports on a secret military base in Tajikistan at the heart of China's plans to challenge Russia for dominance in Central Asia. It's Friday, July the 19th. The attempted assassination of Donald Trump sent shockwaves through America's security establishment. Questions are being asked about the Secret Service's security failings, but also about the normalization of political violence. I asked Rozina Sabur just how volatile America has become. It's now several days since Donald Trump surprised an assassination attempt, the first in 4 decades against an American president or former president. I'm joined now by Rozina Sabur, our deputy US editor, who has been following the story very closely. Rozina, where are we? We're speaking now on, it would be a Wednesday morning, going for 4 days after the attack. What do we know about it? What details are now emerging from that very blurred, hurried early picture?
The FBI is still probing exactly what went wrong here. Joe Biden has ordered a review of the Secret Service's preparation. But so far what we know is Thomas Matthew Crooks, a 20-year-old based in Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump was speaking, was able to climb a roof with an AR-15 and several rounds of ammunition and fire on the former president. He killed one rally goer and injured at least 2 others, as well as the former president. So a key question the security services have to answer is, how was Crooks able to get to a roof less than 500 feet from where Trump was speaking? So what we do know in terms of the security in place is there were 2 sniper teams positioned behind where Trump was speaking on stage, and they appeared to be focused on the crowd in front of him rather than looking to the sides. And it was to Donald Trump's right side that the gunman was positioned. We know that they were at a higher elevation than Thomas Matthew Crooks, but it's been suggested that there were some trees in the way that may have obscured their line of sight. Another thing that's been mentioned is that the gunman was on a sloped roof, and that may have obscured the vision of the sniper teams on the roofs behind Donald Trump. We also know there were law enforcement officials on the ground outside the hard security perimeter of the venue, but they didn't appear to be alert to Crooks until minutes before he began firing into the rally venue. And even when they were alerted to Crooks's presence, it seems there was a bit of a time lapse between them raising the alarm and acting upon it. Now, this is obviously a shocking moment, but also just from a security standpoint, a huge failure of security. I've been to dozens of Trump's rallies, and very often they're in more remote locations. I have a vivid memory of walking through fields in Ohio to get to one in particular. And part of the reason for that location choice is they're much easier for the Secret Service to secure a perimeter around There are fewer places for potential bad actors to stage an attack from. So we do know that this incident, the shooter was outside that Secret Service perimeter. So there are questions as to whether that perimeter was wide enough, whether they were too reliant on the local police force to be manning that external perimeter, and also the communication breakdown between law enforcement and the Secret Service, which is ultimately responsible for the security of any of Donald Trump's events.
What are the Secret Service, the police, other agencies saying? Are they blaming one another, or are they keeping mum and saying things like, well, there's an investigation and so on?
Well, by and large, they're saying there's an investigation going on and we'll get to the bottom of this, but it's going to take some time. But we have heard from the Secret Service director. She did an interview with ABC News, and there was a bit of finger pointing. One of the things she said was, incredibly, the roof the gunman was on, there were actually local law enforcement officials inside that very building that he used to stage the attack from. And one of the things she said was perhaps there's a communication issue there, but she's also mentioned the fact that the roof was sloped, suggesting that there may have been a safety issue for law enforcement. So rather than being on top of that roof, they decided to secure that building from within, from inside the building.
Do we know anything else about Crooks's motive at the moment?
We know very little about motive, and one thing that Joe Biden and the law enforcement agencies leading this investigation have stressed is we shouldn't be too hasty to make assumptions about what his motive was. The picture we've built of him as a person doesn't offer too many clues. We know he was a bright student. He studied engineering. He was working in a nursing home at the time. His employers say there were no red flags that they had spotted. Friends described him as a little bit odd, but ultimately deemed harmless. He was a registered Republican, but he had also donated to a left-wing cause. His parents, I believe one was a registered Democrat and the other a libertarian. So quite a mixed picture in terms of the political background. Not a lot of clues to point to what his motive was in this attack.
Of course, one of the big questions around this is whether this is an isolated incident that came out of anywhere, or whether it is somehow a product of a wider trend of a radicalization in American society. You've been living and reporting in America for several years. You know the place pretty well. You said yourself you've been to a number of Trump rallies. Is it your sense that America today is a more febrile place, that something like this was going to happen?
Well, I think this has to be seen in a wider context. America has been down this path before. Obviously, you mentioned in your opening, 4 US presidents have been murdered in office. Reagan and Teddy Roosevelt both survived attempted assassinations. If we wanted to take a narrower lens in terms of recent history, we might look back to the Obama era as a bit of an inflection point, a president that received around 30 threats a day. I think the political atmosphere has only become more febrile in the years since the Obama administration. And let's not forget, it's not just presidents and presidential candidates that have fallen victim to it. Gabby Giffords, the Democrat congresswoman, shot in the head in 2011. Steve Scalise, a senior Republican in Congress, severely injured in a shooting at a congressional basketball game in 2017. Then, of course, we had January 6th, the Capitol riot. Mike Pence was a target there. We had crowds of people chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." That very same day, Kamala Harris came within close proximity to a pipe bomb placed outside the Democratic National Committee headquarters. We had the attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of the then Speaker of the House, in 2022. And then even just this year, we had Nikki Haley, a Republican presidential candidate, requesting Secret Service protection while she waged her campaign for president because of the increase in threats she was seeing. We've also seen recently the homes of Supreme Court justices targeted. I suppose what I'm saying is there is a historical context to this, but yes, it does feel as if the threats are increasing. The atmosphere is becoming more febrile.
There's a professor at the Chicago Project on Security Threats who studies, this kind of sentiment in society. Now, he said his latest survey was conducted by a respectable pollster on the 24th of June, and that found 10% of American adults, or about 26 million people, said they would agreed with the use of force, that the use of force was justified to stop Donald Trump becoming president, which is an extraordinary number. He said that's actually more people than those who support violence to restore Donald Trump. He said there's about 7% of American adults who would support that. Now, these are not people who are saying they themselves would commit violence. These are people who are saying they would support or understand someone else doing it, to be fair. But those are extraordinary numbers. And I'm just interested in whether, when you're going around doing your reporting, when you're at Trump rallies, when you're just working in the country, whether that is an atmosphere that you can tangibly feel.
I would say, by and large, it's not. One obvious day that stands out to me is January 6th, 2021. And when people ask me about reporting outside the Capitol that day and watching people storming this previously seemingly impregnable building, what I say is actually the day for me, the most jarring moment actually came earlier in the day, when it was about 6 o'clock in the morning and I was outside the White House waiting to be let in by the Secret Service, funnily enough, because they wanted to press there very early because of the security measures in place. And I remember people coming into the city, and even that early in the morning, about 6 a.m., there were supporters of Donald Trump walking through the streets, and they spotted us, and we were identifiable as journalists, and they started yelling and pointing, "Oh, there's the fake news media." And you could feel the anger coming from them. And as I say, very early in the morning, and that temperature just built and built throughout the day. So in a lot of ways, what we saw on January 6th was incredibly shocking, but in many ways it wasn't surprising. It felt like the natural conclusion to the way the day had been trending. But I would say, by and large, when you go out and you speak to people, as I said, I've been to dozens of Trump rallies and I speak to lots of his supporters. I wouldn't say the prevailing attitude is one of great anger and a support for violence, just as I wouldn't say that about Bernie Sanders rallies that I've attended or political rallies for people on the left. I think by and large they're positive events, but there is always a minority that has this tendency, this strain of violent rhetoric that we hear. But in terms of those polls that you've just mentioned, I have to admit I'm not familiar with them, but I would say polling can often overstate the sentiments that people feel, and sometimes what people say in polls isn't exactly how they would respond to an actual event. I think the majority response to Donald Trump's assassination is one of shock and condemnation.
Do you think, obviously, in the aftermath, we've seen an awful lot of calls, including, to be fair, from Donald Trump himself in his first statement after it happened, but also from Joe Biden, also from across the political spectrum, a lot of calls to call it. A lot of people saying, look, like, American domestic political rhetoric really has got out of control. We've all got to take a look at ourselves in the mirror, calm things down a bit. It's time to put the brakes on this incredibly highly volatile rhetoric that we've all been throwing around. Do you think this incident is actually going to change that, or do you think the very well reported deep polarization in American society, in American politics, is just too well entrenched now to really be rowed back on?
Well, I always feel that predicting the contortions of US politics is a bit of a fool's errand. But my immediate sense at the moment is I do feel that this might be a moment that jolts the country into a bit of a reconsideration of the use of rhetoric we've been accustomed to hearing in the last few years. I'm in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention at the moment, and the incident on Saturday has most definitely affected the tone of the conference. Donald Trump and his supporters often portray him as a martyr. We see that in the language used about his criminal cases. He says, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you. About how he describes the establishment in Washington. He talks about a deep state that's out to obstruct him. And so you could very well imagine that this latest attack would be weaponized by Donald Trump and his supporters as yet another example of an evil establishment state coming after him or failing to protect him. And in fact, the message we're hearing here from the Trump campaign, I've spoken to some of the former president's senior advisors here, as well as what we've heard from speakers on stage, is one of embracing unity. So Donald Trump's called for Americans to stand united. We heard from one of his former rivals, Nikki Haley, last night. She also talked about unity. We've heard from a range of speakers also at the RNC that we wouldn't usually expect to hear from. A head of one of the major unions was here. He was given a huge speaking slot, and he talked about economic terrorism, and he railed against big business, things that you would never expect to hear at a Republican Party convention. On the other hand, we've had people like Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican Senate leader and a vocal critic of Donald Trump, booed while he was speaking on the floor. We also don't have former GOP statesmen like George W. Bush present at this event. It's a bit of a mixed picture. And obviously there is a political calculation happening here in calling for unity. The Trump campaign are very aware of the message that Ronald Reagan put out after his assassination attempt. We saw Reagan enjoy quite a boost in support after that failed attempt. And we've seen similar language used by the Trump campaign here. They don't want to alienate swing voters. They don't want this attack to be seen as yet another instance of a kind of unpredictable and febrile atmosphere that Trump is sometimes associated with. Now, we'll have to see how long that restraint holds. For now, I do feel that this has caused more of a reckoning within America than we might have hoped at one point.
You've described being to different Trump rallies, and you're at the Republican National Convention now. I mean, you're used to big political events in America. Have you ever been to one where you felt like this kind of thing could happen? Could you ever have kind of, I don't know, hairs pricking up on the back of your neck thinking, God almighty, something's off here? Or is this completely out of the blue for you?
Well, I suppose two responses to that. Did I ever think that a former president could be shot at successfully? No, because we think of the Secret Service as this elite unit, the most sophisticated protection service in the world. You would never imagine that someone could come as close as they came to shooting one of the agency's protectees. But the other question is, have I personally ever felt unsafe? The answer to that would be yes, frequently. Segments in Donald Trump's rallies, they're a staple of most of his speeches, where he turns to point to the media pen at the rally, and he talks about the fake news media, and the crowd gets very riled up, and you can feel the anger and the threat of violence there. And how likely is it that people would actually act on that? I don't know, but just standing there protected by nothing but a metal barrier, I do frequently feel unsafe, yes.
Didn't know you were going to say that when I asked that question. It's really alarming. Rozina Sabur, thank you very much for joining us from Washington. Just before you go, it's an absolutely packed schedule for you in the run up to November and probably afterwards. What are your next movements? What are the next things in this incredibly divisive election that you'll be covering and looking at and travelling to see?
Well, in the immediate future, we're looking to Donald Trump's speech on Thursday night. He claims that he had a humdinger of an address to deliver, but he's thrown it in the bin since this assassination attempt, and he's rewriting it to call for to turn down the heat and to call for unity. So we'll see if that holds. I spoke to one of his senior advisors yesterday, and he said, be prepared to be there for about an hour and a half at least. The man can deliver a speech. So that's in the immediate future. Then obviously there's this big question mark over Joe Biden's future and the viability of his candidacy. The Democratic equivalent of this week's events is happening in Chicago next month, but the Democratic Party is attempting to speed up the process by which they formally nominate Joe Biden as the nominee. And they're trying to do that virtually. So we could see within the next 2 weeks more pressure from within the Democratic Party building to reconsider whether he is the best candidate to represent them in 2024. Or we could see Joe Biden prevailing against this intra-party dissent. All very exciting and quite unpredictable.
It's incredible. Rozina, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Satellite photographs obtained by the Telegraph reveal that China has been building a secret military base inside Tajikistan, a poor, mountainous former Soviet republic in Central Asia. Senior foreign correspondent Sophia Yan has been there, and she told me how great power competition and Islamist terrorism could make this the next geopolitical flashpoint. Sophia, could you maybe begin by telling us what Tajikistan is like? It's quite a remote place. Lots of our listeners won't ever have been anywhere near it. What does it look like? What are the people like? What is this place?
Tajikistan is smack dab in the middle of Central Asia. It's located in a very interesting spot in that it's sandwiched between China and Afghanistan. The entire southern border of Tajikistan is essentially the northern border of Afghanistan. And so it's situated in a very curious part of the world. It's not a very big country. There are remote areas that can take quite a while to get to, but a lot of towns and villages, you could drive to them in a couple of hours from the capital of Dushanbe. And Dushanbe itself is developing rather rapidly with the help of the Chinese, with some Chinese investment. It's in many ways like every other city, but it's very new. It makes other capital cities in Central Asia look like Dubai, which says a lot. It's still very poor as a country. It was part of the former Soviet Union. And in terms of countries that came out of the former Soviet Union, it is still the most poor. And the government is grappling, as well as the people, with a bit of an identity crisis. They've got all this Russian influence still in the country, but Tajikistan has Persian heritage, but also having very close ties to Iran are problematic. And so Tajikistan, again, a relatively small country trying to battle and figure itself out and stand on its own 2 feet when you've got all these big countries linked to it, China, Russia, Iran.
Well, let's talk about that identity crisis a little bit. As you said, Tajikistan long within, I suppose, what you might call the Russian sphere of influence. That is waning, and this is what this article, this fascinating article that you've written, is really all about. Essentially about how China appears to be kind of, is it fair to say, filling a vacuum here?
Yeah, in many ways China is, because the eastern border of Tajikistan is the western border of China. This is of concern because also part of this is linked to the Afghan border. So there is this one spot where all 3 countries meet. And China has been really very worried about this particular spot for some years now. They signed a security pact in Tajikistan in 2016, and shortly after that started to build out its military presence in Tajikistan, so across the border from China in a different country. There's now even a second base along the southern border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, a little bit further west from this one I'm talking about, in this very remote part where China, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan meet. For China, it's about essentially ambitions to expand, to have and to push its influence into Central Asia, itself a very interesting region because of its history as part of the former Soviet Union. It's in this part of the world where you can see this China versus Russia rivalry really play out. China's got the money. China always comes and says, we're going to help you with your country. We'll help you develop in the ways that you need to. And Russia right now is ostracized on the world stage because of its invasion of Ukraine. Russia also very busy because of that invasion. And so here comes China at just the right moment. In terms of the China-Tajikistan relationship, it actually benefits Tajikistan to a certain extent because the country, while it's very rich with natural resources, we're talking about metals, gold and silver, for instance, but also even more strategic materials that are necessary for items like solar panels or munitions. They've got all of this stuff in their land, but not the expertise and the ability to develop it. And again, that's where China comes in. But once China comes in, who's really going to benefit from this in the long run? Is it Tajikistan or is it China? This is the question that a lot of people have. But the government in Dushanbe, they don't always have many options because it is a very small country.
Tell us a little bit about this mysterious Chinese military base, which you seem to have uncovered. I've just seen a report on Radio Free Europe saying that the Chinese embassy in Dushanbe has denied the report that it's building a military base in Tajikistan, calling the reports groundless.
The Tajik Foreign Ministry have also denied it too, but satellite images that we have from 2013 onward for a 10-year period, this was done with the help of Maxar, which is a satellite imaging firm. It shows the change right on this very remote frontier area that I'm talking about, China, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. This is really no man's land. It's really rocky, rugged terrain. It's hard to get there. There's a couple of villages around, but really there's not much there. It's right by the Wakhan corridor of Afghanistan, also very well known as a rugged part of the world. And when you look at these satellite images, which you can see on the Telegraph website, you can scroll through and see how it's changed over these 10 years from 2013 on. The roads start to get moved around. There are new roads built, access roads to get to the space. And this tiny little set of buildings are built out. And then next to it, a much bigger complex goes up. And this is something, interestingly so, that the Chinese Foreign Ministry, it's interesting that they're denying it because on state media, there have been plenty of reports about greater security cooperation between China and Tajikistan. And there's footage that has been broadcast on Chinese state media showing, for instance, joint border patrol drills. So that cooperation, that security cooperation agreed in 2016, this is not something that is not known about. This is something that actually both countries were happy to tout. And Chinese President Xi Jinping in July, just a few weeks ago, actually visited Tajikistan for the third time, his third official state visit. And so these ties between the two countries absolutely there. The satellite images, again, showing this change and this buildup of the space, and images and footage in Chinese state media that actually promote this cooperation.
That's very interesting. Do we have any idea what's going on in this base? Is it a purely Chinese base? Is it a mixed Chinese-Tajik garrison? Do we know what its purpose is specifically? Or do we just know that it's there?
The general understanding is that both the Tajik side and the Chinese side have people stationed at that base. There are border concerns in the region in general. The Taliban's come back to power in Afghanistan, for instance, and this is a worry not just for the countries around in Central Asia and for China, but really for the world. So there is a border security concern that many countries share. From the China perspective, this is about trying to police this part of the world. China and the western part of the country, and this is the part that borders Tajikistan, is the region of Xinjiang. And this, many of you who follow battle lines will likely know, this is where the Uyghur Muslims live primarily. And this is where China has waged a very serious human rights crackdown, one that some politicians have called a genocide, with more than 1 million people detained in these quote-unquote re-education camps. There were things that were done many years ago, for instance, not allowing men to grow long beards, not allowing women to have head coverings, these sort of anti-religious moves, these bans on people there that eventually morphed into the broader human rights crackdown. And so China wants to pacify this region because they have a lot of interest in building its economic opportunity in the western part of the country and then projecting even further into Central Asia, into countries like Tajikistan. And so when you look at the security partnership, Tajikistan has started doing the same too. And experts I interviewed say that this is because of the increased Chinese influence. Tajikistan itself, a very Muslim country in fabric and culture and identity and history, even though not everyone is always very religious all the time, it's a part of who they are. But even in this country, the government's been trying to institute things that China did, which is the ban on beards, the ban on head veils, things like this. From the Chinese perspective, it's about trying to have greater control so that it has the ability to grow its global economic prospects, which supports its own domestic growth and therefore helps to keep its leader, Xi Jinping, in power. For Tajikistan, again, as I said earlier, this has something to do, it seems, with the border concerns. And also when you're a small country, having a big country, this big panda next door, like China, it's in some ways, it's a positive to have partners like that in your corner.
Let's talk a little bit about radical Islam in that case, because I'm sure many listeners will remember the terrible Crocus City Hall attack in Moscow earlier this year, in which dozens of people were killed. The individuals who were eventually captured and arrested and charged with carrying out that attack by Russian authorities were citizens of Tajikistan, said to have come from there, and also said to be loyal to the branch of Islamic State that is based in Afghanistan. What can you tell us about that case, and how deep does Islamic State's kind of or influence or the level of threat go?
The other story that I was pursuing is exactly this. I went and spoke with relatives and friends of all 4 of the men who were arrested and charged within just a few days of that shooting in Moscow. And in trying to understand what had happened, it really does give a sense of what you're asking about, where things stand with Islamic State Khorasan. And it's a very deep story in the sense that it tells us something about how ISK is looking to recruit people now, its method and tactics, at a time when much of the world is actually distracted with other issues and conflicts like the war in Ukraine. And it also tells us something about Tajikistan's relationship with Russia. So first, these 4 men they're all migrant workers. They were Tajiks who had moved abroad to Russia in search of better paying work. And they're all from rural areas in villages within 1 or 2 hours or so outside of the capital of Dushanbe. Very nice, quiet, mild-mannered guys. That's what their neighbors and friends told us. And none of them seemed to exhibit any sort of extremist sympathies. Some of them actually weren't even all that religious and had family members who had to try to get them to pray regularly. So the jury's still out as to whether or not these guys are involved. Maybe they were the fall guys. That's what some experts think, some experts who study counterterrorism. And the reason they think that is because the way that ISK is operating now is multi-pronged. What they seem to be trying to do is to leverage communities abroad. And so they're using this kind of connection of Central Asia and trying to reach people who are already in Europe or the US, in Russia and other countries, and to raise these small sleeper cells. So maybe you've got one that's like the fall guys.
Can you just explain that? What do you mean by fall guys? Do you mean people who were framed and had no idea they were being set up for this? Or do you mean people who are part of the terrorist group but have been designated the people who are going to be? What exactly does that mean? How does that work? What's the theory here?
It could be either. How much anyone knows of the entire terror plot is unclear. I mean, at this point, all we do know of this case is that ISK claimed responsibility for the attack. They released some footage of the actual attack, also a blurred out picture of people that they say were the ones who perpetrated the shooting. And then we have Russia who trotted out these men, and only Russia saying these are the guys who are guilty. So exactly what happened is still not clear. And it may not come clear for a long time, if ever. Russian court's not exactly the gold standard in transparency. So this is the challenge that we face in terms of trying to figure out what really happened. But in my interviews with counterterrorism experts, they were pointing to how this case, they think, demonstrates how ISK is now operating, which is to leverage people abroad. Migrants, like Tajik migrants who go off to Russia to work, they're very much marginalized. They're often very poor. They're discriminated against at home to a certain extent, also discriminated against abroad. And when then they do go abroad, they are seeking some sort of community, which sometimes can lead them to a mosque, for instance, where there might be a radical imam preaching, or it leads them to certain communities where they're easily preyed on. So the thinking is that once they're abroad, when they're seeking some sort of support network, that's when they are very ripe for being pulled in or tricked in. It's hard to say how much they know or don't know of what's actually happening.
Did the family members you speak to, did they think they were guilty, or did they think they were innocent?
All of them thought that all these guys were innocent. I mean, first, these 4 guys don't seem to know each other. The relatives and friends and neighbors I talked to said that none of their sons had mentioned these other guys. So it doesn't seem like they have any link to each other. But everyone thinks that they are innocent and that they are maybe being scapegoated. To a certain extent, Russia is under a lot of pressure to handle damaged public confidence because of this attack. Even the general sentiment in Tajikistan, I went around to talk to people all over the country about a range of topics, and pretty much everybody thinks that this couldn't possibly be true. There's a sense that Russia, which has always been a big bully of Tajikistan, that's the sentiment on the ground, that they think this is another way that Russians are pressuring and discriminating against Tajiks. What's interesting about why people think this is actually that Russia released a short list of names of suspects almost immediately after. But the Tajik government, and they have an announcement on the website of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, they found two of those names, two of those people on this initial list of suspects that Russia released. Two of them were actually in Tajikistan and had been for some months. So this is one of the examples that people point to as to why they doubt the veracity of, and the innocent, and the guilt, why they doubt the veracity of the guilt that Russia says these four men have.
The government of Tajikistan itself is not by any means a liberal democracy, right? I mean, Amoli Rahman, the president, has been in power since, I think, 1992 or something like that. We had reports, I think, a couple of years ago of Islamic State or other radical Islamist terror groups using his heavy-handedness and his record in their recruiting materials about why you should come and fight for us because of the way this guy runs the country. Tell me a little bit about the political atmosphere in the country and what do we know about Rahman, where he stands as the local strongman in all of this? It's not a happy, liberal, kind of sunny place, right?
No, the government does take a very strong, heavy hand. Dissent is squashed. There is growing security and surveillance technology that's coming from China. And there's a lot of pressure on people who are considered to be anti-government. This is sometimes dressed up in other ways. We see this in other authoritarian countries too. What it's meant is that it can be really tight for young people in Tajikistan. This is a country where many families have at least one member living and working abroad. For many people within the country, they feel very vulnerable. The elite at the top do very well, and for everybody else, you're on your own. Fend for yourself. And so there are many economic difficulties and restrictions on religious freedom. This is something that also pushes young people to go abroad to find a better way of living. And what's interesting is that it fits into, and in some ways can make them very ripe for recruitment by terrorist groups because, as I explained before, once you're abroad, if you're having a tough time, you're seeking a community and you're perhaps easier to be swayed. But even for those who are very educated, there have been cases of very well-educated university graduates in Tajikistan who were pulled into radical terror groups. Groups like the Islamic State, they're looking for people with expertise. They need people who can help them make weapons, for instance. But for those people, it seems, from the interviews that I did, it seems like these kinds of people are interested in these groups because they are also, like many young people around the world, seeking an identity. They don't believe the official authoritarian government propaganda at home. They think there must be some other way, or there are other ways of thinking. And so in their search for that, they come across these groups. In some instances, are drawn to it because it's simply another way of thinking and another way to believe in something. Because you're talking about a country where you're told only one way is the right way. So it does play into the broader picture.
In April, Lord Cameron, our former foreign secretary, became the first British foreign secretary to visit Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan, the first to visit Uzbekistan since 1997. And the thinking at the time was that, look, with Russia preoccupied with Ukraine, there's now some fluidity, some opportunity, even some danger here in Central Asia, and there's opportunities for other outside powers to, including Britain, to have a role there. Are there other players trying to fill this vacuum besides the Chinese? Is there any sign of that in Tajikistan that you saw?
Central Asia is a part of the world that has been so often overlooked. But as I said earlier, this is where the China versus Russia rivalry is playing out. I mean, Russia has been key for so long, for instance, in Tajikistan to help Tajikistan police its southern border, the border that it shares with Afghanistan. But with Russia so busy in Ukraine, that's not possible anymore. countries like Tajikistan feel that they can't rely on Russia. And to a certain extent, they don't necessarily want to either, because they want to let go of this history, the Soviet history. And so China can swoop in and build its influence. And where that goes really remains to be seen. China itself, an authoritarian state, armed with the most cutting-edge surveillance technologies that you can imagine. I lived there for a long time, and what they're doing is unparalleled. There's nothing like it. I always talk about it as a quote-unquote dictator in a box. It's like a bit tongue-in-cheek, but China can export all of that to other countries, and they can install this system, these digital systems, to exert more control over their own populations. It's not that hard to do in a way. And China's already doing that, as I saw in Tajikistan and as I've seen in other countries, this kind of surveillance technology and network already in place in many other parts of the world outside of China. So this is the worry. And now with the Taliban back in power for about 2 years or so in Afghanistan, there is concern that this part of the world could become very volatile, that some unrest could erupt. This is something that the U.S. government, different parts of the U.S. government, including the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, they've warned about this, about the increasing risk of terrorist attacks. While the world is busy, it's essentially created a window of opportunity for groups like Islamic State Khorasan to reconstitute, to rebuild. And where that goes from here, it's a big question mark, and it's definitely worrisome.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Dagahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.
Hey parents, Greenlight is here to take one big thing off your to-do list, teaching your kids about money. With a Greenlight debit card and money app of their own, kids and teens learn to earn, save, and invest. You can send money instantly, set flexible controls, and get real-time notifications of your kids' money activity. Set up chores and put allowance on autopilot to reward them for their hard work. Then learn about the world of money together. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.